Hello! You're listening to Everyday Encouragement, Timeless Truths for Today, a weekly podcast designed to bring you snippets of encouragement to help you as you go about your day. I'm Jenny Guy, your host. Do you sometimes wish you knew what God was doing as He answered your prayers? Have you ever wanted an inside track on how He's thinking as He orchestrates things in your life? Well, God explains His actions in 2 incidents in the book of Exodus. I think you'll find His explanations relevant to us today. Let's get started. Do you ever become impatient and wonder why God is taking so long to answer your prayer? Do you wonder why the answer that He eventually gives seems to be the very opposite of what you've been praying for? Do you wonder what He's really doing? Well, I stumbled upon a couple of incidents in the Old Testament that helped me understand why God sometimes answers our prayers the way that He does. I observed that on those occasions, God didn't do what was expected. Instead, He did something that took longer to execute, but was definitely for the Israelites' well-being in the long run. And what's equally important, God explained His actions during those incidents. I called my observation the principle of for our well-being. I know the name is kind of clunky, but I think you'll soon see what I mean. The principle states that no matter how strange or out of the ordinary God's actions may appear, they are for our well-being. Now, the principle can't and shouldn't be used to always explain God's actions as He answers our prayers. That's because God reserves the right to respond each time in the way that He knows is best for us. The principle's usefulness is in helping us understand delays and detours on the path to certain prayers' answers. Here are the 2 incidents that show how the principle of for our well-being functions. The first incident occurred right after the Israelites left Egypt and were on their way to Canaan, their promised land. In the 13th chapter of Exodus, the 17th and 18th verses, the Bible says, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt, ready for battle." There are 2 interesting facts to note in these verses. The first fact concerns the Israelites' mindset. They were described as leaving Egypt ready for battle. In their minds, they were warriors, able and prepared to take on any and all challengers. In reality, the Israelites were newly freed ex-slaves who hadn't been trained to use weapons or design battle strategies. Excited by the knowledge that they were free people, under no one's authority and accountable to no one for their daily actions, the Israelites assumed that their freedom automatically conferred upon them battle readiness. The second fact deals with God's assessment of their readiness for battle. He said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. God knew that the Israelites' exhilaration over being free people was causing them to overrate their abilities at that point in time. He knew the Israelites would be filled with fear if they were challenged by the Philistines, one of the mightiest nations in the world. Instead of escaping and seeking shelter in the desert and starting new lives as free nomads, the Israelites would have chosen to return to Egypt and guaranteed re-enslavement. In the future, they would certainly become the warrior nation that God intended for them to be. But at 10 minutes past midnight, just after Pharaoh told Moses to take his people and get out of Egypt, they weren't those warriors. Did you ever play dress-up as a child? Did you put on your mother's high heels and carry her purse, or wrap your dad's tie around your neck and put on his hat? In that moment, wearing your parents' clothes, you felt like you were as grown as they. But you weren't. Even though the Israelites were armed and dressed like warriors, they weren't. So when God saw his children all dressed up in their high heels and ties, he decided to lead them by another way to their destination. Granted, this alternate way was longer and would delay their entering Canaan, but the time it would take to travel this detour would give God the time he needed to grow his children up into adults capable of handling their new land's challenges and responsibilities. This was the principle of for our well-being in operation. The second incident where this principle is illustrated also occurs in Exodus, when God tells his people how they will conquer their promised land. The 23rd chapter, the 27th through 30th verses say, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. I will make all your enemies turn their backs and run. I will send the hornet ahead of you to drive the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites out of your way. But I will not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate and the wild animals too numerous for you. Little by little, I will drive them out before you, until you have increased enough to take possession of the land. This time, God is saying that if he removed all of the Israelites' human enemies immediately, then their animal enemies would overrun them. Again, God needed time to have the Israelites increase their numbers through births, as well as increase their ability and skill in taming and living in a wild land. The way God got that extra time was to leave some of the Israelites' human enemies in the land for them to conquer later. I believe that this principle of for our well-being is working in our lives when it seems like God is taking forever to answer our prayers. We may think we're ready to handle what we're praying for, but God knows the true state of our readiness. He may need time to develop us in our ability to handle what we're asking for. I also believe the principle is working whenever we don't understand what God is doing. In those situations, the principle helps us because it implies that we should be comforted by the knowledge that whatever God is working out is for our well-being, no matter how long He takes or how roundabout His methods seem. Here's an example of the principle in operation today. Let's say that you have qualified to be promoted on your job, but the promotion has been delayed. When you finally move up, you learn that there's been a retroactive pay grade increase, payable in a one-time lump sum. Now, not only do you get the position's increased salary, you receive that one-time bonus, which just happens to cover an emergency. Or consider this example of the principle at work. The financing on your dream house fell through, and you're no longer able to buy it. After moaning over your loss, you pick yourself up and try again with another house. This deal goes through, and not so surprisingly, this house suits you even better than the dream house would have. I'm sure that if you stop and think about it, you can come up with other examples of when the principle worked in your life, whether you recognized it or not. So, the next time you get impatient and wonder about the status of your prayers, read these two incidents in Exodus. See what understanding you get about your situation. Remember the principle of for our well-being. And above all, remember that God is for us. I hope you heard something today that has encouraged you and possibly given you something new to think about that will motivate or inspire you. If you would like a PDF copy of the show notes for this episode of Everyday Encouragement, Timeless Truths for Today, visit my website at jguypublisher.com. New episodes are published each week on Wednesday. I hope you'll join me for another installment of Everyday Encouragement, Timeless Truths for Today. Well, that's it for now. Until next time, be encouraged.